on the states in northern Nigeria. I have an outline of presentation, which, as you can see, next please. As you can see, the outline of presentation is such that I have two parts. I will make the presentation in two parts. The first part deals with the issue of restructuring in Nigeria generally, which I believe is a necessary precondition before a discussion of restructuring and its impact on socio-economic development in the states in northern Nigeria. So under part one, I will discuss what I call I will first have a general introduction, and then I will discuss characteristics and features of the current federal structure. I will discuss what I call the associated outcomes, and then the consequences. And then I will also discuss what, in my view, may need to be done in order to improve the current structure at the federal level. In part two, then I more specifically discuss the peculiar challenges of northern states and also the outcome and the consequences of the current structure. And then I discuss what is to be done in these states, given their peculiar challenges, the peculiar challenges that they face, and also having made a number of recommendations on what is to be done, then I now discuss how can this be done, because it's very important to not only understand what needs to be done, but also how it can be done. And then I have some concluding remarks, and then I have provided a few references which I have used in the presentation, and then provided what I call related readings. I'm hoping that after this presentation, the slides can be shared with all the participants in this group.
The slides will be available to all the participants. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move to the general introduction. Well, I begin by observing that restructuring the Nigerian Federation has been a very topical issue, certainly since the commencement of this republic in 1999, but most especially it became more vociferous from the 2003 elections, culminating into all sorts of constitutional conferences we had in 2006, and then subsequently in 2014. Indeed, restructuring has become a buzzword, which means different things to different people. And advocates speak often at cross purposes, such that for the people, the more you hear, perhaps the less you understand. Next. Now, federalism is supposed to be a model of political accommodation and power sharing, as well as a cure for micronationalism. Because federalism is supposed to help manage diversity in such a way that there will be a sense of belonging, and in such a way that people will not withdraw into their cocoons in forms of a micronationalism. Now, Nigeria, if we look at our experience of operating a federal system, really it has shown, as I have mentioned in a presentation in 2017, Nigeria's experience has shown that our federal arrangement has not ensured a stable political accommodation, and it has not ensured equitable power and the resources sharing. And instead of curing micronationalism, it has fanned what I call the embers of its conflagration. Many people attribute the perpetual ethno-religious and communal crisis bedeviling Nigeria to imperfections of the federal system. and hence agitate for restructuring. In any case, there is a very strong advocacy for restructuring the Nigerian federal system because of a number of reasons. And these are, one, the perception that a restructured federal system will create a better precondition for enduring peace in the nation, that restructuring would improve equity and justice in governance in our country, and that it would eliminate or drastically reduce deep-seated perceptions of marginalization, and that it would create a sense of national belonging to diverse Nigerian ethno-religious and communal identities, and also that it would catalyze or facilitate rapid, desirable socio-economic development. These are really the arguments that are proffered to support the need and the advocacy for restructuring. Now, from the advocacy and the debates and the discourses, restructuring may mean any or a combination or all of the following. One, a return of what some people call true federalism. It's a bit vague, but they say, let's return to true federalism. Then secondly, some say that we should revert to what they call the 1960-1966 regional structure, in which there will be a federal government and the federating units will be the regions. Others have advocated for a six-zonal or regional structure based on the geopolitical zones that now are being talked about, which came into prominence as advocated by Alex Ekweme, I think in 1995. Others argue, or rather see restructuring as the creation of more states, especially in a geopolitical zone that feels that it has been marginalized, that is the Southeast geopolitical zone, which has less number of states compared to the others in the other 5 zones. Yet others advocate resource control, advocate restructuring in the form of what they call resource control. And the resource control really also is often very vaguely defined, but in essence, people are saying that whatever resources are in the state or in the region, the revenues from those should accrue fully to those states or those regions. Some are even saying to the communities in those states and these regions. So that's what they argue. In any case, resource control. That's why I put it in quotes. And yet others are asking or advocating for restructuring in order to have what is called equitable redistribution of power, responsibilities, and the resources amongst the federation, amongst the federating units. That is between the federal and the state governments, and the most particular in Nigeria, because our federal system is very unique and it operates a 3-tier structure, distribution of power between federal, states, and the local governments. Now, when we review the advocacy for restructuring in Nigeria, what is not being said and what I believe need to be said and should accompany any discussion of restructuring is that unless any form of restructuring is accompanied by additional reforms to entrench good democratic governance, all the expected lofty objectives with restructuring may not materialize. So what is absent is a discussion of the kind of governance framework that should accompany restructuring for it to be effective and to result in desirable socio-economic development. Therefore, I have emphasized in this presentation, because it needs to be emphasized, that any form of restructuring, whether nationally at the federal level or more specifically in the states in northern Nigeria, have to also be accompanied by necessary governance reforms which can then ensure that the objective of restructuring is actually brought about. And I say also that reviewing the advocacy for restructuring, there are 3 pertinent questions which are requiring for answers. The first question is, what should restructuring substantively and realistically entail? The second question is, how can restructuring be brought about? And the third question is, how should federal revenues best be collected and shared? Or who is to collect them, and how should they be shared? So hopefully this presentation would address all of these questions, both in the context of part 1 discussion on restructuring at the federal level, and subsequently the part 2 discussion of restructuring at the states in northern Nigeria. So if we now go to part 1, let's move to part 1. So in part 1, I discussed the characteristics first and the features of the current federal system. And I think the first thing to be said is that nobody can doubt or disagree with the fact that there is a disproportionate distribution of power and responsibilities among the federating units. Again, in the Nigerian context, the federating units are the states with a central or federal government. And then we have the peculiarity of a constitutional recognition of a third tier, which is the local governments. So therefore, in the Nigerian context currently, one feature is the disproportionate distribution of power, first between the federal and the state governments, and then secondly, between the states and local governments. Then secondly, there is concentration of power at the federal level in the hands of the president or the presidency, and at the state levels in the hands of the governors. The third feature is the cost of governance. Presently, the federal system we operate and the governance framework that accompanies it, particularly the presidential system of government, seems to be very, very costly indeed. And fourthly, there is lack of inclusivity in governance. The governance framework excludes or does not include youth or women or minorities or persons with disabilities or persons with physical challenges. And fifthly, there is also disproportionate allocation of resources. And this is reinforced by perceptions of inequity and injustice, especially by the diverse ethno-religious composition of the country. Now, the result of these characteristics in the operation of the federal system is what I call associated outcomes of the current structure. If we can move to this, clearly, we can say that there are enforced inequalities in the way in which the federal structure is operated. We may disagree about the extent or who is affected by this, but clearly there are enforced inequalities. There are increased inequities and to a large extent also injustice, particularly in the way in which governance takes place. There are also increased perceptions of marginalization. There are aggravated differential identities, ethno-regional and communal, ethno-religious and regional and communal. And there is also erosion of what I call citizenship rights and obligations, particularly at the state level, where the phenomenon of indigenship seems to take prominence and priority over citizenship rights. And of course, there are perpetual conflicts and crises all over the country, largely on account of the character or characteristics and features of the federal system. And there is arbitrariness in governance, and there is also humongous corruption in governance. Of course, the consequences of all of this combined is what one can call a dysfunctional structure, a dysfunctional federal structure, because rather than facilitating accommodation and minimizing micro-nationalism, it seems to be reinforcing diversity and the fault lines of this diversity, as well as pushing people more and more into micro-nationalism. And then, of course, the second one is inefficient or wasteful or even controversial allocation and utilization of resources, especially at the federal level, but also at the state levels. And of course, there is also bad and poor governance. And that's why any discussion of restructuring has to consider how to bring about good democratic governance in order to ensure restructuring actually becomes beneficial and catalytic for socio-economic development, whether at the federal, national level or at the state levels. And of course, one of the consequences also is what I call the constrained or obstructed socio-economic development. As the federal system does not operate well, and as conflicts emanate and become widespread, attention is diverted, resources are diverted, and all these are complicated by bad governance, and therefore socio-economic development is constrained or obstructed or remarkably undermined. So what should be done? And I have identified what I think needs to be done at the federal level and the state levels generally, before I now discuss what I think needs to be done at the level of the states in northern Nigeria. So I think at the federal level, it is very, very important to recognize the need for devolution of power and responsibilities, as well as resources from the federal to the states, from the federal government to the states. I think one uniqueness of the Nigerian federal system also is that when you look at the exclusive federal legislative list in the Constitution, as well as the residual list, there is over-concentration of power and responsibilities in the federal government. So these need to be devolved more into the states, because if they are devolved to the states, then obviously more resources will go to the states in order to take care of those responsibilities and to catalyze also socio-economic development. So there is need to review both the exclusive, the concurrent, and the residual lists in the 1999 Constitution as amended. And in particular, I think that we have to begin to think how good practice in the operation of federal systems globally sees that responsibilities such as primary and secondary healthcare provisioning, primary and secondary education, works and housing and urban development, with the exception of highways and railways, agriculture, are all state responsibilities, with sufficient resources, of course, for them to be able to undertake these responsibilities. So the federal government should only have what I call national policy and regulatory authority over these areas, which will provide and/or provide incentives or even disincentives to states and local governments for even development and affirmative action. But really, if we want an effective federal system, we have to learn from good practices globally, and we have to make sure that federal government does not operate a primary school or a unity school, or operate primary health care facilities. And I think, or even works, and housing and urban development. These are matters that really should belong, responsibilities that should belong to the states, except, as I said, highways and railways, provision of highways and also railway lines across the country, because in all federal systems, again, the major power of promoting commerce and ensuring seamless interstate commerce is that of the federal government. And the highways and railways actually improve this issue in terms of integration of the country for commercial activities, for social activities, and so on. So again, at the federal level, perhaps the powers that should really be the responsibility of the federal government, essentially, and again, as happens in most federal systems, should be foreign policy, currency, interstate commerce, armed forces, maybe postal services and telecommunications, and the mining. Actually, mining can be either a concurrent responsibility or indeed can be devolved to the states. Policing, I argue, should be made a concurrent responsibility. And it is evident in Nigeria that policing by the federal government has not been effective, and there are many challenges. It can be improved, but perhaps from what we are seeing, particularly in states that are ravaged by banditry and insurgency and robbery, armed robbery, and so on, there is need perhaps to make policing a concurrent responsibility so that there will be federal policing at certain defined areas and responsibilities, and then there will be other responsibilities where the state should be able to handle policing. Then there is need to revise revenue allocation formula accordingly in order to ensure that states receive resources commensurate with the devolved responsibilities, while the federal government obviously receives less commensurate to the reduced responsibilities that would be left to it. Similarly, there is need to strengthen checks and balances that would curtail unrestrained use, misuse, and the abuse of power and the resources in all the three arms of government, whether the judiciary or the legislature or the executive. And I think one good practice in many federal systems that we may need to introduce in this country is to appoint inspectors general in each arm of government, or ministries or MDAs, that would do regular administrative audits and monitor compliance with constitutional provisions, acts of parliament, and relevant laws and regulations. This is very, very important. In Nigeria, we pay attention more to financial audit, which is not even done very effectively, but it is also important to recognize the need for auditing of administrative responsibilities in order to ensure that the democratic good governance is actually protected from misuse and abuse of power and resources. So if these are things to be done at the federal level, what then should be done at the state level? And I have also recommended that at the state levels, there should also be devolution of powers and responsibilities, as well as commensurate resources to the local governments to make them more functional, and also to catalyze what I call grassroots development. In fact, in addition, at the state level, I am even recommending the creation further down below the local government of what I call district level administrative areas or development areas. And that will take government even closer, much more closer to the people. Of course, the challenge is having it well established with competent and well-trained personnel, and also good elected representatives, plus the resources for them to be able to handle certain responsibilities in terms of community development. And then at the state level also, there is need to introduce and strengthen checks and balances that would also curb unrestrained use, misuse, and the abuse of power and the resources at all the arms of government at that level. Again, I believe, as we know, power is concentrated in governors and at the local government levels, chairmen of local governments. And it is important also to ensure that there are mechanisms in place that can check some of these abuses and that can ensure that we nurture and entrench good democratic governance. And at this level, we may also have to think about perhaps the necessity of also appointing inspectors general for administrative audit to monitor compliance with the constitutional acts. At both the federal and local government levels, it is very, very important to also ensure that there are mechanisms in place to reduce cost of governance. And I believe such measures as the following can help. And obviously there has been a lot of discussion and debate. And in fact, a consensus seems to be emerging on many of these recommended aspects of cutting costs of governance at both federal and state levels. For example, the number of personal assistants, senior special assistants, and so on and so forth. This has to be drastically reduced. We have to reduce overhead costs. Clearly, it's unwholesome in any governance system, and even more so in our own governance and system and structures, where over 70% of budgeted funds go to overheads rather than to capital and infrastructure development. So it's very, very important that we reduce this remarkably. We must also drastically reduce, and these are things that can be done even without legislation. They can be done by administrative regulations, reducing, for example, foreign trips. In Nigeria, we are infamous globally for really very, very frivolous foreign trips by government officials. And that is largely because it's driven by ESTA codes. So ESTA codes needs to be substantially reduced. And many of us who have done some work with international organizations or have been invited by other governments abroad see what is provided as ESTA code or day living allowance, which is very, very minimal. And in Nigeria, what we provide is really, really unimaginable in many countries globally. So we can cut costs remarkably by reducing foreign trips and the ESTA codes associated with them. And also by stopping the pensions of these former governors and deputy governors and retrieving some of the houses that have been built for them in Abuja and Lagos, and stopping it henceforth, because really it's a huge wastage of resources, particularly those who were governors and then received pensions and now come to the National Assembly, particularly to the Senate, and collecting salaries as well as pensions. I think these are things that almost a national consensus seems to be emerging on the need to address this. And then, of course, there is need to reduce also the number of ministries and the MDAs, and which will mean reducing the number of ministers and commissioners and so on at these levels. Again, we need to perhaps consider making the work of the legislators part-time. Again, there is a lot of discussion in that regard. And also reducing the size or composition of the legislature. Do we need to have 3 senators from each state? Or can we reduce the number of senators coming from each state? Do we need to have the number of elected members of the House of Representatives? Maybe we can reduce it by 1/3 or so. And that can really drastically also cut the cost of government. All the talk about moving from presidential system to parliamentary system, which will create its own challenges, I believe can be addressed by a drastic reduction in the cost of governance. And there are ways we can do that. It's only that we are not doing that. And that's why people are calling or demanding for the jettisoning of the federal system and its replacement with a parliamentary system. But most importantly, and this is very good both for governance and for a desirable operation of a federal structure, we must entrench the culture of leadership by example from the top to the bottom of the administrative and governance hierarchies. Right now in governance, what we see at the state levels and the federal levels is that those at the helm of affairs are invariably the first people or category of people as leaders to break rules and regulations or to set bad examples. So that culture, which is absolutely necessary in democratic good governance, we have to nurture it, we have to entrench it, because it is what can facilitate a good operation of a restructured system at both federal and state levels, and what can also nurture and entrench good democratic governance. Okay, so this I think is a necessary discussion, because everything I have discussed here in terms of what needs to be done to restructure the federal system is applicable to not only the federal system, but all the states in the federation. But in part 2, I speak more specifically, as has been required of me by this panel, to discuss more specifically about what kind of restructuring and reforms are necessary in the states in northern Nigeria because of the peculiarities of these states in order to drive desirable socio-economic development. So in this context, I begin by saying that states in northern Nigeria have relatively peculiar characteristics. I think everybody recognizes that, which makes desirable measures necessary, additional measures necessary for restructuring in order to address them. And also, compared to other states, I think everybody recognizes that these states have been drastically bedeviled and constrained by, these peculiar characteristics have obstructed and constrained socio-economic development in these states. And of course, unless these challenges are addressed, these states would not only continue to be disadvantaged and have obstructed development processes, but would also drag the whole country down and constrain the country's socio-economic development. The peculiar challenges are many. In the next slide, I have listed them, and I think they are all well known to all of us. I think I can save time by not discussing them. The next slide will show these peculiar challenges as I have itemized them. Next. Next slide also. Next slide. And these are some of the illustrations of those peculiar challenges. There are so many: insurgency, rural banditry, kidnapping, armed robbery, high number of ungoverned spaces, poverty, exponential population growth, women reproductive health challenges, high number of out-of-school children, lowest level of illiteracy, deindustrialization, massive underdevelopment, and underemployment and unemployment, and remarkably poor democratic governance or collapse of governance in many instances, and lawless vigilante groups, lowest contribution to national GDP compared to other states, particularly in southern Nigeria, the phenomenon of drug abuse amongst youth and also amongst women, the devastation of desertification with negative environmental or rather serious environmental degradation, high numbers of displaced persons in IDP camps, massive dissemination of crops and livestock, and therefore the life wear of the economy of states in this area. And so there are many of these, as I have, but in this particular slide, I have given some statistical illustrations of this. For example, the phenomenon of out-of-school children, more than 30 million out-of-school children in the states in this region, and approximately that represents approximately about 30% of school-age going children. In fact, UNICEF has provided statistics this year about how 39% of children in the Northwest states in particular, the 7 states with the exception of Kaduna, are out of school. And this is very, very serious. Almost 40% of school-going age children are out of school. And you can imagine what this portends for the future of the states in this region. Then with regards to poverty rate, of course, all the states have significant percentages of the populations in poverty, classified in poverty or below the poverty line. The national average is 40%, but it ranges between 77% to up to 87% in some states in this area. And in fact, the average for these states is that 70% of the population are classified as poor. And this compares to 24% that are classified as poor in the states in southern Nigeria. And then there are other statistics which I have provided in this slide. So what are the outcome, of course, and the consequences of this is declining contribution of agriculture to economic growth in the region, declining farming and other economic activities in the region, negatively affected livelihoods and human security in this region, declining contribution of the states in this area to national GDP. Of course, there is humongous corruption in the public sector in the states in this area. In fact, some statistics are suggesting that of the resources that go to these states, budgetary resources in these states, anywhere between 40 and 60% are frittered away, either by the contractors or those who give the contracts or those who supervise the contracts or the ministries and so on and so forth. And this is a very, very serious challenge that needs to be addressed. Next slide. So given all these peculiar characteristics and the consequences and the negative features of all of this, what needs to be done in addition to what I have discussed earlier in part 1 in order to ensure that restructuring catalyzes socio-economic development in the states in the those states in the northern parts of Nigeria. And I begin by saying what I think many people have recognized, that there is first the need for considerable energy and attention to be devoted to mobilization, sensitization, and what I even call conscientization of the people in these states, for them to understand first the nature, extent, and magnitude of the crisis and the challenges afflicting the region, as well as their causes and viable solutions. And then 2, the need for restructuring and governance reforms for socio-economic development in these states. And there is also the need to galvanize stakeholders in these states for advocacy and struggles, and putting pressures and taking a lead in order to ensure that this mobilization happens, and the need for restructuring is not only accepted, but is pursued. And in this regard, I also think that there is need for what I call alliances and partnerships by critical stakeholders in all of these states, particularly civil society and non-governmental organizations, in order to really drive the necessity of understanding the challenges and also working towards addressing these challenges. Next slide. In particular, there is need for what I call interstate and sub-regional cooperation. So in order to address most of these challenges and peculiarities of the states in this region, there is need for the states to collaborate and to develop cooperation arrangements and to strengthen these arrangements and to make them effective. Because many of these challenges can only be addressed through cooperation and partnership and collective coordination, not a focus in individual or particular states. And I think insecurity, the challenges of insecurity clearly illustrate this. The issue of out of school children roaming about and all the phenomenon of the Almajiri children, all of this would require collaboration and coordination to address. Also, state governments need to pursue a strategy for balanced and equitable socio-economic development with a focus on human security. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, there has been a general move away from strategic development planning or even mere development planning as we knew it in the past. And this is very, very necessary, and particularly to address these peculiar challenges in the states in northern Nigeria, we have to go back to strategic long-term planning, categorized into what can be achieved in the short, in the medium, and in the long term, but it has to be strategic planning. And there is need for strategic planning, for example, to be based either on 2 electoral cycles of 8 years or 10-year periods, you know, and then subdivided into medium and long-term development. And I think the key areas of focus should be education, health, agriculture, both crop and animal husbandry, infrastructure, both urban and rural, small and medium scale enterprises, especially agro-allied, but all of this focused on the issue of comparative advantage. For example, in many states, there is tremendous potential for solid minerals development. These have been left to artisanal producers, and it is important to really upscale and modernize solid mineral exploration and development, either through medium scale enterprises or even larger scale, depending on the potentials and the availability that has been established. And security, and then employment generation. I believe that in the states in northern Nigeria, in order to address the peculiarity of the challenges, there is need for the next 10 years to prioritize education, health, agriculture, infrastructure, SMSEs, security, and employment generation. And we should structure the governance framework, the ministries and the MDAs, primarily along these lines. And I think it's very, very important to do that, because really addressing these critical areas or sectors would be the precondition for catalyzing sustainable socio-economic development in these regions. With regards to SMEs and employment generation and entrepreneurship, the states must also give attention to enlightenment campaigns and capacity building through training workshops in order to scale up access to federal government's institutional support for agriculture, for commerce and industries, for poverty eradication and others. And unfortunately, it does not seem as if any state, maybe very, very few indeed, are really paying attention to this. This is very, very important if we want people to access federal resources in order to also help address some of these peculiar challenges. So if people don't know where the resources are or how to apply for them or how to follow them or what documentation is required, it's difficult for those kinds of resources to come and add value to the resource requirements of sustainable development in these areas. When I talked about strategic development, it's also necessary to ensure that we also develop a framework for executing strategic development planning in the states. Because unfortunately, in many of these states, the civil services and public sector has virtually collapsed. So there is need to pay attention to civil and public sector reforms to ensure a trim and efficient and effective service delivery. And the recruitment, of course, needs to be based on meritocracy. And there must be also opportunities for constant training and retraining for upgrading of skills and competence. There is no time to elaborate on this, maybe during questions and answers. But really, the craving for federal character and the bad governance or collapse of governance in many of these states has driven away most of the competent and experienced staff from the civil and public sector of these states to the federal level, whether into customs or into immigration or into some of the MDAs at the federal level and so on. You know, and no wonder that even if some states have resources that, and you have some governors that have the honesty and modesty to put resources into development, there are no effective and efficient support services from the civil service to be able to do this. So reform of the civil service is a critical requirement in ensuring that we catalyze sustainable economic development in the region and in this regard. Ministries and commissioners need to be allowed relative autonomy to carry out their statutory functions, but they need to also be carefully selected to head, carefully selected. So competence needs to be taken into consideration in the appointment of ministers rather than purely partisan considerations. Currently, as we all know, in many, if not all of these states, power is concentrated in the governor's office, and virtually many ministries hardly do anything. And so it's necessary to deconcentrate the powers in the governor's offices, to devolve some of these to the cabinet office or the SSG's office, and indeed into many of, into the other ministries and MDAs. I think it's also important to ensure that frivolous, impulsive, and wasteful expenditures by governors or top functionaries of government are checked and or sanctioned. Unnecessary trips to Abuja or abroad with associated costs, or donations and gifts by governors to all sorts of causes, in most cases by charlatans, are needed to be addressed. And this can bring remarkable reduction in the cost of governance also, and the freeing of some resources that can actually go into necessary development projects for sustainable socio-economic development. There is also a need, as I have said, to return to medium and long-term planning. There is also a need to improve the revenue base, and this is very, very important. Right now, most of these states simply rely on federal allocations from the federation account. And it is absolutely necessary that the revenue base is diversified, and also the principle of cutting cost according to size is imbibed in terms of modesty and prudence in public spending. And specifically, I think efficient utilization of what comes from the federation account is necessary. But in addition, the revenue base needs to be expanded and the sources of internally generated revenues nurtured and entrenched. Blockages, of course, need to be, leakages need to be blocked, and new sources of generating revenue need to be found. And I think there are many, really, if we apply our minds to that. Maybe we can discuss that again if there is time in discussions. But in general, I argue that there is need to put mechanisms in place for efficient, effective, and transparent utilization of public funds in these states, as well as generation of additional resources to the federation account, resources that come to these regions. Next, there is need to reestablish governance, because all of these things we are talking about, if governance is not re-established and effectively entrenched, will be very, very difficult to actualize. In particular, because of insurgency and the banditry, rural banditry, there are many ungoverned spaces, and governance need to also be re-established in those ungoverned spaces. It is also absolutely necessary to then further democratize and strengthen local governments and their administrative structures and systems. We should ensure quality representation in elective offices of chairmen and councillors, and we should ensure remarkable improvement in the integrity of elections by the state independent electoral commissions, which currently are bedeviled by interference by the executive and by fraud and by disenfranchisement of voters. There is also a need to devolve more responsibilities and resources to the local governments. And I think it's very, very important to do this, particularly once we are able to upscale the competence and the capacity and the integrity of elected representatives at that level. There is need for more functional roles of traditional rulers in local governance. For example, particularly with regards to security, surveillance, and the intelligence gathering, as well as in alternative dispute resolution. Now, while we advocate for this, and we hope that this can be brought about, but it is important to also say that there seems to be a tendency of the traditional rulers becoming laid back because they are not involved by government. And by virtue of their positions of responsibility in communities, they need to really exercise leadership and be proactive. And rather than sit down look, they need to actually be very, very actively engaged in mobilizing communities to address some of the peculiar challenges that address them. And then there is also a need to nurture and entrench inclusive governance, which accommodates diversity at the level of the states, and which creates a sense of belonging to all, and which ensures representation and participation regardless of ethnic, religious, and communal identities, and regardless of gender, age category, and physical disabilities. In the states, really, in particular, there seems to be demobilization of the youth and the women and persons with disabilities rather than including them in the processes of governance. If they are needed, it's just to support elective campaigns and so on. And it is very, very important that these categories of citizens, citizens and indigenes need to be brought in this regard. I hesitate to use the word indigene because of the way in which it has a negative connotation. Now, so these are the things. I have said it very quickly and briefly, but the slides will be circulated and people may have time to look at them and reflect over them. But it is, I'm recommending quite a lot. And I'm sure the elephant in the room and the questions that people have been contemplating is how can this be done? You know, how can all this be done in the current setup? You know, because we say there is poor governance. We say power is concentrated in the governors' offices. You know, we say there are no resources. It's only now that we are agitating for the need to expand the revenue base. So these governors that are misgoverning, you know, can we rely on them to do that? Physicians, can the physicians actually heal themselves and then bring about this desirable democratic, sustainable development, socio-economic development in these regions? So it's a big question. And obviously, it's a big question that has no easy answers. But I believe that if stakeholders organize themselves and develop alliances, they will be able to effectively engage governors even in the next 3 years to be able to have some desirable outcome that will be facilitative of that desirable governance reforms and socio-economic development. So it's very, very important to address that. So as I said, there is currently remarkable misunderstanding, unwillingness, and lack of political will to pursue necessary restructuring by leaders in the political, legislative, and governance arenas at all levels, whether at the federal, but particularly in these states that we are talking about. So stakeholders who understand the need and desirability for these restructuring and governance reforms need to join hands and the efforts and get the executives through advocacy and pressures, not only the executives, but also leaders in the legislature to accept the need, to recognize and accept the need for restructuring and to commence the process. And I believe if the process is commenced, a lot can be achieved in the next 3 years, particularly in terms of creating the necessary framework for having more competent and more experienced leaders, more modest leaders to be elected in the next electoral cycle. So attention needs to, at the same time, be focused on subsequent elections between 2020 and 2023. There will be many elections, whether local government elections or by-elections, or until we get to the general elections. I think at each of these levels of elections, there is need for stakeholders to develop strategies and to join hands and to say enough is enough and to begin to mobilize people to pay attention to election of people who have the competence, who have the integrity, and who have the experience to be able to bring about value addition in the governance of the states in particular, and in the governance of the country in general. And in this regard, obviously, the electoral process needs to be imbued with increased integrity, credibility, and greater popular participation. So the focus should not just be limited to the state level elections and also the improvement of state independent electoral commissions, but also engagements for electoral reforms, even at the national level, are very, very important. So stakeholders need to rigorously or vigorously sensitize and mobilize the citizenry for increased voter registration. This is very, very important. Voter education also, because if voters register and they are not well educated about their voting rights or the need to vote, they may not come out to vote. So mobilization and sensitization has to be for voter registration, voter education, in order to have informed and enlightened voters, and also mobilization and sensitization to ensure that people actually come out during elections to vote. So these are the things that I have identified as what is necessary, and if we are able to do a lot or many of these in the medium term, definitely we will have remarkable improvement in governance and also in addressing the peculiar challenges of these regions. But addressing the structural, or rather embarking upon restructuring at the federal level in the manner in which I have recommended can also go a long way to address some of these challenges in the states. And in conclusion, I will run through this very, very quickly. I have said that the Nigerian legislature or even the executive seem to be either overwhelmed or lacking in political will to pursue restructuring as is being advocated for at the national level. And where attempts were made, the methodology was ineffective and the result was inconsequential. The methodology had been either the executive branch organizes so-called national conferences, and we had two so far, or the legislature embarks upon wholesale constitutional review and amendment, which really they cannot and they have not been able to successfully do because of the controversies and the other responsibilities that they have. So I have said that if we have to do wholesale constitutional amendment, perhaps we have to think out of the box. And perhaps there, what we may need to do is to have a constituent assembly that can be an elected constituent assembly solely for the purpose of constitutional review, and so that there is no executive interference, there is no legislative brinkmanship, and whatever they produce can then go through the constitutional process, submitted as an input to the National Assembly to be passed. I said that in any case, I have preferred and have recommended incremental positive changes. I don't think that for now, particularly in the next 3 years, we should begin to think of a constitutional reform or rather restructuring with regards to creation of more states. It's necessary to look at some of those, but in the medium to long term. But in the next 3 years, I think attention should focus on devolution of and the concentration of powers and responsibilities and resources from the federal government to the state governments and from the state governments to the local governments, with commensurate administrative and governance reforms that can ensure effective utilization of these resources. Because of course the fear generally is that if you take more resources to the states in the way and the manner in which they are currently governed, then many of these resources will also be frittered away. So that is why administrative and governance reforms in the short term also have to accompany the restructuring, but also there is need to ensure that there are also reforms to the electoral process, which can ensure that the electoral process will bring into the political arena and political space more and more competent, experienced, credible people, because that is required in the medium and long term for national development, but also for local development. There are a number of other things, but I think I've taken quite a lot of time, and perhaps I should just stop here. But let me just say that I want to conclude with just a few paragraphs. I think I want to remind us of the Chinese proverb that the fish begins to rot at the head. And I think the lesson we can draw from this is that when collective leadership is rotten, particularly at the head, then society would stink unimaginably and whittle away. And we need to all make concerted efforts to prevent this from happening. And therefore, we need to begin to ensure that wherever we see rotten heads in our collective leadership, we struggle and strive and ensure that we address this. It's very, very important. And I think all hands need to be on deck to be able to restore normalcy, to have effective restructuring and the concentration of powers to make our federal system more viable and more effective, and therefore to ensure socio-economic development at the in the Federation in general, and more specifically in these states that are experiencing very, very serious challenges. Thank you very much for your patience. And I have a long presentation which I tried to rush, and I think I have taxed your patience, but I hope I have put a lot on the table to allow us to have a good discussion. And many of the things are actually for further reflection. And perhaps by the time you have copies of the slides and you read them, we may be able to also generate maybe state or regional or national debates on the need for restructuring and administrative reforms, both on the short, medium, and long term. So thank you so very much for your patience. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Professor Attahiru Jega, there for your presentation. I'm sure a lot of our audience have learned something new from this session. Not only did you address what needs to happen in order to kind of start moving towards restructuring the political space for socio-economic development, you've also addressed kind of what we need to do to actually start the implementation, because we've talked often here about the fact that Nigerians are often, especially in the North, we're really good at sitting down and perhaps drafting what needs to happen, but actually getting things to be implemented is very, very difficult. So just to kind of summarize and wrap up before we start talking to the audience to see what they have to say, because I know there is a lot of people in the audience waiting patiently to address you, Professor Jega. I wanted to say, I think it's very important and very interesting that you pointed out, the need to distribute the power really from the federal level and start distributing it to the state level, the power and the resources to actually implement change. But beyond that, even at the state level, there also needs to be a steady distribution of power, because there seems to be a huge concentration at the moment. And we need to also address the need to use our resources wisely, which I think is something we're really becoming more and more aware of these days in Northern Nigeria. I think you've highlighted a lot of the different struggles we face here and the peculiarities that we have, particularly in the North, that we need to address to really pull ourselves together in terms of the key indices for socioeconomic development. And I think the key thing to understand here is we often say we need to act. We do need to act, absolutely, but we need to plan and we need to have strategic long, medium, and short-term goals to work towards as a northern area. And I think it really goes to show that you said we need to sensitize people. And I think it's really good that we're getting such a huge outcome of people really here today to listen to you on 3LogyTalks to really understand what needs to be done. So there are people passionate really to be mobilized and to know what to do. And it's really down to the key stakeholders out there to organize themselves and form partnerships where they can actually implement the change, because there are people out here here is our audience, here is me trying to actually see what can be done and what needs to be done and trying to get change implemented. So before we open the floor for our general audience, we'd like to just take a few moments to address some of the people in our audience, just to say, give them a chance to give their opinions on what we've discussed today. So First of all, I'd like to address Malam Murtala Aliyu. He is the Secretary General of Ariwa Consultative Forum. He's in our audience today, so I want to take a few moments to hear what he has to say on our conversation to see if he has any points to add. Malam Murtala Ali, you have the floor. Thank you for joining us once again. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you.
Let me start by thanking Professor. He has quite taken us on a journey that is both academic and also practical. Mm-hmm. And I believe we have benefited. And when the paper is circulated, I'm sure we'll be richer for it. And I'm sure it has triggered quite a number of things that will now have an outcome after the discuss. I'm sure there'll be some follow-up actions in that. But I just want to really raise one issue, which I thought would touch the peculiarity of our own federation, which, when you say a federating unit, is like units that on their own decide to come together to federate and form a body. And in our own case, right from the amalgamation of 1914, the units were administratively brought together, and continuously the government as Center for Administrative Convenience kept breaking us into various units. So I don't look at Nigerian units as federating units, but maybe just federal units. The other thing that I would wish maybe when Prof has time to talk about is the issue of our political parties. Because no matter how much you structure the governance structure, when the political parties are not structured, or when they themselves are not democratic in their own nature, you find that they keep springing out people that will, at the end of the day, not necessarily give us the best that we can, or we need. So I think if during elaboration, if Prof will also touch on that. And then the other one he has touched about, that's the peculiarity of the northern economy, the smallness of our economy, and the way we are trying to copy or behave like the rich states. If Lagos State has 21 ministries, you find that Yobe State will also, Ojigao, Ogombe will want to have 21 ministries and so many commissioners, and so huge a structure of governance. So I think, like he suggested, the size of governance should be structured in such a way that it will just match our own resources and our own size. When we grow our economy, we can grow large. So let's take the time. I say we want to thank Prof. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Ali, for joining us again today. Wonderful to have you here. Next, we have Dr. Garba Abari here with us. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Garba Abari is the Director General of the National Orientation Agency. He's very welcome with us. So I'm going to open the floor if you have any comments to make. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Fatima. And let me also seize the opportunity to thank Professor Jega for a very robust presentation. There is no need to recap what has already been said. In fact, what I would rather suggest is that after we must have distributed this paper and maybe digest it further, we can reconvene for further discussion. But let me add a point here under what needs to be done. Murtala has talked about the political parties. I will talk about the political parties and the political processes. What we have at the moment is actually a political system that is largely governed by a rogue political culture. And this has largely impacted on the quality of governance and, of course, the quality of leadership that emerges to lead at different levels. For as long as we do not find or refine our political processes and institute a properly structured leadership recruitment system where merit, competence and the capacity take the place of mediocrity, then to a very large extent we shall continue to end up with political players that do not even understand the basic principles of public service, and therefore we shall continue to be dancing around issues with no ideas, with no ideas, and the ideas actually are now the prime movers of development the world over. We cannot be talking about, say, for example, we cannot be talking about, say, at the moment, a political system with this level of concentrated powers. Look at what we have with the governors. The state houses of assembly. When Professor Jega talked about the powers in the more concentrated in the governor's office, the powers are not concentrated in the governor's office. The powers are concentrated in the governor's hands. And the House of Assembly, the legislature, the local government chairman, the commissioners, the permanent secretaries are all in the pockets of the governors. In fact, not only in the pockets, but they are also in the back pockets. So he sits on them. So these are all some of the issues that we need to actually deal with, you know, and dealing with them must have to comment.
So it seems, unfortunately, we have lost Dr. Garba Abari, but he touched on some really great points there about refining the whole political. Oh, I think we're
on how to change the this situation. And of course, I agree with you largely.
Thank you very much for your comments, Dr. Garba Abari. Thank you very much also for joining us.
Fatima, you are muted.
Oh, can you hear me?
Fatima, you are muted.
Can you hear me now? I hope everyone can hear me.
You are muted.
Okay. So I think I can now be heard. Thank you very much for your comments there, Dr. Garba Abari. We appreciate you being here, and you've made some really good points about the need to restructure the whole political recruitment process. Even I think that would be a huge move towards the right direction if we manage to do that. So thank you very much for your comments. With us also in the audience, we have former Vice President Atiku Abubakar. I'm going to unmute the floor and allow you to make any comments. Thank you very much for joining us. You have the floor. Hello. So it seems we're having trouble there opening up the mic. So what I will do is I'll move forward and we can come back. All right, so with us also is Dr. Kola Shatima. He's the country director for the MacArthur Foundation. So I will open the floor also. Dr. Kola Shatima, you have the floor.
No, Fatima, I don't think, I don't want to make.
Okay. All right. So we'll go through then. Sorry about the technical issues that we're facing today. We have also Amina Laden. She is Baki. She's the director, or sorry, so we'll have the floor for her. So you've had your hand up. Thank you very much for waiting. So we've unmuted you to take the floor. Amina Laden Baki.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much for joining us. Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I must say, I'm really impressed by your presentation, Prof.
Mm-hmm.
I'm particularly interested in the way you discussed the issue of community participation, because I think basically that is what we lack. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the community does not understand or is not willing to understand our systems. Mm. And I think we need to concentrate on educating people about their situation, about their environment, and for them to understand that things are what they are because they allow things to go the way they are. So people have to be, you know, sensitized to understand, you know, the meaning of the whole democratic system that we have decided to, you know, to adopt. And I think it will be a very good idea, Prof, if you can possibly translate your lecture into a language that people can understand as well, so that we get, you know, to the very bottom, you know, to sensitize people about issues that you have raised today, which are really very, very important if we need to move forward. And I would also like to ask you about this, the proposed inspectors that you know, started, you know, by recommending.
You can't hear.
Who do these inspectors report to? Is it the government?
Oh, okay. I didn't hear what.
Hello?
Sorry, yes, we can hear you.
You know, you recommended the proposed general inspectors, inspector generals earlier on. And I'm just wondering, you know, it was while you're talking about checks and balances, but who do these inspector generals report to?
Right.
I think we need to, you know, to have more information on that one. And otherwise, I'm really impressed, and I hope we will do as much as we can to make people understand what you know, the issues that are discussed, and we can do that successfully by translating as much as we can what you have discussed today, and then, you know, spreading it across.
Okay. Thank you very much, there, Amina Ladam Baki. She's the director of Sir Ahmed
Sorry, former director.
Former director of
Former.
And thank you very much for joining. And I think you've made a great point there about the need to mobilize the community, and even just to translate and educate them, even with these slides, to languages that they can understand. And also that that auditing procedure, who do the auditors report to? And I think that's a very good point. So thank you very much for taking the floor. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you. So we also have Kabesi Jacob Eason. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to see you in the audience. So I've unmuted you, and you have the floor. Kabesi Jacob Eason. Hello. All right. So it seems I can't hear you right now, but maybe when you solve the speaker issue, we can take your question. So we have a few people here in the audience with their hands up, Professor Attahiru Jega. And so I know there's a lot of people wanting to ask the questions. So I'll open the floor to allow them to ask the questions, and we'll take quick and brief questions, 3 at a time, to try to make sure we get as many questions in as we can. So first we have Bashir Buhari with their hands up. So unmute and allow you to ask your question quickly. Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't hear them from the other, from the other side. I didn't hear anybody again.
A wonderful presentation.
I didn't hear.
My question is the issue of banditry, especially in the northern part of the country, the northwest part. I don't know whether maybe it's because I joined late, but I have not seen the issue being addressed in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the issue of banditry. Next, we have Shamsuddin Imamo with his question. So I've unmuted the floor. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Okay. Shamsuddin? Sorry, we lost you there quickly. So Shamsuddin, we have you back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Prof for the very illuminating lecture. In line with what previous speakers have said, particularly Dr. Garba Abari, I will want Prof to also talk about the issue of what the situation is in our political parties in Nigeria. For almost everybody who have participated in elections from 1999 to 2019 will give testimonies of the fact that in the northern part of the country, the political party leaders from the ward level, the ESCOs to the delegates, if we observe, most of them at that lowest level are somehow semi-illiterate. If you go to a venue of a primary election like I did in 2015, to my utmost surprise, I realized more than 75 to 80% of the delegates that were responsible to choose the flag bearers of the political party could not even write. You have to get someone who will write the name of the candidate they are voting for. This is a problem that really our leaders in northern Nigeria really need to look into. Perhaps we need to raise the bar. There should be a basic qualification or a basic requirement for the emergence as a party leader, as a party ESCO, as a delegate. The delegates are responsible for choosing the flag bearers. This is not a problem that is peculiar to PDP or APC. Almost all the political party leaders and the delegates, once it's time for primary elections in northern Nigeria, if you go to any venue, you realize that there has to be someone who will write, who will assist the delegates write who they are voting for. So that is also a fundamental issue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Shamsuddin, for your question there. Next, we have Dr. Salamatu Hussaini Suleiman with us in the audience. I wonder if you have a comment to make. She is she is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Commissioner of ECOWAS Political Affairs, Peace and Security. If you have comments, it would be great to hear from you. Thank you. So, hello.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Fatima.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Prof, for a very, very exciting and very well-researched paper. I was quite impressed as usual. I think the problems of the North in particular have been discussed several times. We'll never tire to hear them. And I believe there's a general consciousness currently to try at least to tackle them. And the kind of paper Professor Jega has provided gives some kind of background, particularly for the younger persons that have become very conscious of how we want to move our country forward. I think it behooves on all of us. We are all stakeholders, and the sooner we all focus on getting this country on its right footing, the better. So thank you very much, Prof. It has been exciting listening to you, and I hope we'll carry on these conversations going into the future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Salamatu Hussaini Suleiman, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I hope to see you again.
Thank you.
So Professor Attahiru Jega, we've had a few questions there from Bashir Buhari with the banditry question on banditry and insecurity, to Shamsuddin about the current situation in the political parties. And I think generally within the audience, within our speakers, they've definitely spoken about the need for mobilizing the youth and the young people. And you can see that there is definitely the energy. There's a lot of young people here in the audience who've taken time to listen to you. So I would love to hear your comments now, Professor Attahiru Jega.
Thank you so very much, I thank all those who have commented and raised questions also. But Bashir, I think if you notice, I have on one or two of the slides, I have listed what I consider to be the peculiarities or the peculiar challenges that states in northern Nigeria face. And obviously, almost at the top of it is banditry, because that is the thing that is now very topical and very, very devastating of communities and livelihoods, you know. So, but I did not if I had to speak on each of these peculiar issues, we probably would be here until maybe tomorrow. So I just itemize these issues, recognizing them as the challenges and as the reasons why we need to restructure states in northern Nigeria and improve the governance framework to be able to address them. But one of the recommendations I have made is also, if you notice the 5 or 6 sectors, which I said should be concentrated upon in the next 10 years, security is one of them. And I have said that bearing in mind the peculiar challenges of banditry, armed robbery, kidnapping, Boko Haram, and others. And we see quite clearly that the federal government, both the police and the armed forces, have serious challenges in terms of either equipment or personnel or training, and they are now overstretched and dispersed, and this is contributing to part of the ineffectiveness of addressing the challenges of rural banditry. So if we can reduce, or rather move the issue of policing, as I have recommended, from an exclusive federal list in which only the federal government can have police, you know, then we can empower the state and move it into a concurrent legislative list, then that will give the states also the power to create state police within certain responsibilities, and that can actually help in addressing some of these peculiar challenges, especially banditry, you know, because it's difficult to have police. I mean, some of the ungoverned spaces where the bandits have taken over is because you can't even have a police station. You know, the police is so overstretched that really they cannot provide sufficient coverage, and they also don't have the personnel. Right. You know, not to talk of equipment or motivation or training and other things. So I think making policing a concurrent responsibility with federal police with defined jurisdiction and state police with defined jurisdiction can actually help in terms of fighting, improving security, fighting insecurity, and addressing some of these challenges in the states. So security itself is a topic that really needs to be for a discussion to be organized upon, and that's why I couldn't go into details on that. But let me just quickly say that I appreciate the points made by both Murtala Aliyu and Garba Abari about the challenges of political parties. I must say that we used to say in 1999, when we commenced this journey, we used to say that the legislature was the weakest link in the democratic chain in Nigeria, because although all the executive and the judiciary have all existed, even under military rule, the legislature was banned and replaced by an armed forces ruling council or something. And so in 1999, we now had a legislature that was inexperienced, lacked capacity, and so on. But now, I think we can say, 20 years into this journey, we can say that it has now emerged that the political parties are the weakest link in this democratic chain. And we need to focus attention in reforming, revitalizing, reorganizing political parties to address both the capacity for popular mobilization and also to ensure that they have internal democracy. You know, our political parties, as we all know, are marriages of conveniences. That's why now you cannot distinguish between one or the other of the two dominant parties, because they just keep moving and crossing. They were formed out of, they were marriages of convenience. There are desperate politicians who wanted power, who are not concerned about democratization within the party structures. All they wanted was a platform to contest and win power. And so the desperation which they show in electoral politics is also the desperation which they show in the management of the political parties. They don't pay attention to recruitment of members. They don't pay attention to training of members and sensitization of members. You know, they don't pay attention to even mobilization of voters, of people to register. You know, so there is a lot that needs to be done. And that is why people need to register and belong into political parties in order to alter what I call the bad balance of forces in these parties. Right now, the dominant tendency is not democratic. It's anti-democratic, it's authoritarian, it's roguish, as Garba Abari said. And unless more and more people come into these political parties to free them from that control and dominance of those rogues, obviously the challenges will continue. So young men and women need to register into parties. Choose a political party depending on your ideology or inclination, but go in there with the intention of ensuring that you contribute to building the parties, you contribute to making the parties more democratic, more inclusive, more participatory. And in the long run, there will be value addition.
Right.
You know, because the more good people get into parties and then get into the electoral arena, the more we can have good people and credible people and better people in elective positions.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I also agree with Garba Abari that leadership recruitment process has to be carefully reconsidered.
Absolutely.
And it's very, very important. This is something that really many people have been discussing.
Absolutely.
I know that Osman Bugaje and many other, Kole, Shatima, and many others have been discussing this issue. Really, we have to ensure that, you see, again, when you have roguish people dominating and controlling political parties, they can only recruit, if they recruit at all, people who can support that tendency.
Absolutely.
You know, so when we talk of recruitment of people into leadership positions, I think we should be talking about people getting into these political parties, ensuring that they are more and more democratic and that they either abide by their constitutions or they improve the structures and processes within the parties for getting better people elected. I think this is absolutely necessary.
We have a lot of questions out here in the audience and a lot of audience members patiently waiting to ask you questions. And I know we were really tight for time. So what I'll do is I'll take 3 more questions just to kind of get the ball rolling. I will share the slides. They will be available to the audience on our website, www.trilogy.net/talks. There'll also be a copy of this kind of recording, so you will have availability. And I'm sorry to those who cannot get their questions across. Don't forget, we do have a forum to continue the conversation. So www.trilogy.net/forum for continued discussions in case you don't get your question across. So I know we have in our audience Kabesi Jacob Eason, which we tried to open for you. We'll open again for you. Hopefully we can hear you this time. You have the floor.
Oh. Hello?
Hello, yes, we can hear you. Thank you for joining. It's good to see you again.
Thank you very much. I must commend Professor Jega for a very brilliant and well thought out exposition on the way forward. My take is we really don't have much time. I believe Professor Jega should step up and try and get like minds to get us going on this journey. What we have right now is precarious, and we owe a duty and a responsibility to generations that this must not fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we also have Barnabas here with us, and I've unmuted. I see your hand up, so I've unmuted the floor.
Thank you very much, Fatima, and thank you very much, Prof, for this very loaded presentation. Good evening, everyone. I usually would like to start my contributions to this kind of conversation by asserting that Nigeria is a highly dysfunctional society. And my concern, or one of my concerns, is that this Fourth Republic was unveiled in 1999. And 21 years after, you know, we are still, we get into this kind of conversation. This is about the same kind of, this is about the length of time that it has taken some of the Asian countries to leapfrog from third world to first. And Prof has significantly pointed the way. The question then will be, is anybody listening? Because often, you know, those who are supposed to even deal with this kind of matters, those we expect to make these changes, are they actually listening? And I recall that, you know, the slowness with which we are taking some of these things. Many years ago, I'm sure it's over 5 years now, since a bill, for instance, on the bill on violence against women and children, you know, was sponsored by Senator Chris Anyang in the Senate, and up till today, it's not seen the light of day. So I think the priorities for our political leaders are very different from what the rest of us.
Definitely. So, I mean, you've definitely pointed out a great point there. Thank you very much for your comments, Barnabas. The snail pace of our development, what is going on, who is listening, or who needs to act, like what do we need to do to actually mobilize and impart change? So this is a great point, and I hope Dr. Jega can give us a bit more light. I know he pointed out a bit of that during his presentation. So we have Awal Muhammad in the audience also. You have the floor. Do you have any comments to make?
Thank you very much, and really my appreciation to the presentation by the Prof. But I really wish to take it a little bit into what I call practical implementation, Prof. I hope I'm correct. I have you had joined one of the political parties. If that is true, I will really appreciate if you can move this presentation into a reality as to how can it be executed. I would really advise, if you're in that political arena, play like the late Mal Aminu Kano. Please don't take the whole Nigeria at once. Even if you take one state in the nation and let's experiment all these ideologies, it's more than enough to pass the message, and then that can be expanded on. That is one. And the second one, the northern Nigeria is facing a total economic collapse. That is the reality. I think the current generation somehow have been shielded, or that reality has not come forward to many of us. With a population of over 70% being declared poor, that is just a total collapse systems. So any political party that comes to say we want to reorganize the governance really must address this issue. The issue of kidnapping, the issue of banditry, they are all the result of collapsed economy. So I really challenge or I request the Prof and the team to come up with the issue around economic rejuvenation of the northern Nigeria. I keep repeating 2 points on this economic issue. Lagos State was working to that Ambode to issue 21 billion to industrial development in just one corner of the state. Whereas Kano State, the largest in the northern Nigeria, could not declare, could not even afford to issue 0.5 billion, that's 500 million naira, industrial development in Kano. So this is a total economic collapse, and I really look forward to solution to this economic issue.
Comments there. Thank you. We also have quickly Sa'adatu. You've had your hand up patiently waiting in the audience, so I'm going to unmute the mic and let you take the floor, and then we can go back to Professor Jega for his comment. So we can talk. Thank you very much for joining us, Sa'adatu. You have the floor.
Okay. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Prof, for the well-thought paper presentation. Like the last speaker spoke, I know Nigeria has a lot of problems. And I think if we want to tackle the whole of Nigeria right now, that's not going to work. My worry is the North, like the last speaker spoke. How are we going to start with the North? Because even if we solve the problems, or we provide solutions to the problem in Nigeria, the northern Nigeria is problems is peculiar. So we have to solve the problem in the north first. How do we get the 19 governors of the north to come together, cooperate, and start? Because no one person can do this. Do we appoint a committee of elders? Do we have one person in the whole of the north that can lead this campaign, educate our people to realize that the north has been left behind? We are so behind on so many fronts. We need to do this now. There is no time. We need to come out with a communique. We have to come out with points. The Prof has enumerated them. We have to get somebody who will drive these solutions with the governors. How do we get them and force them? Because they are a power unto themselves. You can advise them, but tomorrow they will just turn the other way. How do we get them to do this thing? We need to start with the north now. Time is running out.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sir Attahiru, for taking the floor for questions. I mean, that's what we ask. Like the question, when we ask about how do we get change, it's always like put pressure on the people. How do you put pressure? What do you do? Who needs to take responsibility? That's a great question. So quickly, before we turn to Professor Jega, we also have Asma Ubaba in the audience. You'll have your question.
Okay, hello, Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, so good evening, everyone. Lovely session today. And so over the past few weeks watching 3LogyTalks, I am proud to see how much this program has grown, especially in Northern Nigeria. My question goes to the organizers. Does 3LogyTalks have any sponsorship or support from any body or organization? I haven't seen anything like that on the website. Maybe Northern Governors Forum, ACF, ERDP, or any certain individual. Thank you.
So for us, we're kind of doing this a passion for the development of Northern Nigeria. So that's where we're standing right now. We're building ourselves, and we've kind of, it's a 3-month show so far. So thank you very much with the support of Shamsuddin, Mama, and Nas. We've all been kind of working on this to kind of build this platform, pull together like-minded people who are really passionate about the development of Northern Nigeria and to kind of motivate and educate each other. So it's really been a great support network for between ourselves. I see my co-host in the audience with his hand up. If you have anything further to say, we're going to turn to Jega in a little bit. So I'll give you the floor quickly, Shamsuddin.
Okay, thank you very much. A lot of people have been asking the same question. 3LogyTalks is we're a group of passionate northern progressives, some living within Nigeria, some in the diaspora. We are progressives who come together. We are not supported by the Northern Governors Forum. We are not supported by the ARDP. We do receive support from the ARDP and the ACF in terms of maybe reaching out to some of the people we invite to participate on the platforms, but we do not receive, we have not received any financial support, and we have not asked anybody. We come together to see how we can sustain it with the proud support of 3Logy Limited, and 3LogyTalks goes on with your support. We identify key issues to discuss, and just for the passion of our people.
Thank you.
We are not supported by anybody. We do this together. We're in it together. Asma is part of 3LogyTalks and the progressives. We're all in it together.
Thank you very
much.
Thank you very much. Yes, this is a passion that we have, and it's really great to have everyone in the audience. And thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out of your day to join us. So Attahiru Jega, Professor Attahiru Jega, there were a lot of good questions and comments made by the audience members directed towards you in terms of understanding what we need to actually do to impart change, and how do we break it down into manageable pieces. So I'll give the floor back to you to make your comments on these questions from our audience members.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think very, very good questions have been raised, and I will not pretend to have all the answers to these questions. I think we all need to reflect on this Perhaps out of that collective reflection, better ideas and solutions would emerge. I do agree with Barnabas Omali that Nigeria is dysfunctional and that our process of reform, if any, has been very, very slow. And many people in government, leaders, whether political parties or legislature or executive branches, also are so engrossed with the power that they have and the use or abuse of that power, and they may not be listening to the ideas that are generated on platforms such as this. And so I have mentioned, I think, on another forum, that one of the challenges we have, particularly also in these states that we are focusing on, is that those in charge don't have ideas, and they are also very afraid of people who have ideas and don't listen to them. They don't ask for ideas, and even when you generate ideas unsolicited and pass to them, they don't spare the time to interrogate the ideas and to see how useful they are. So to me, I think the issue of stepping up and get going, as Jacob Essan has put it, it's not an individual thing, it's a collective thing. All of us who recognize the need to bring credible reforms in the process, need to begin to form alliances, need to join groups, and the need to be able to really collectively help to drive this process of advocacy for reform and ensuring that we demand a listening voice to be able to drive this process. So the first real leg of the process is joining organizations, creating alliances of stakeholders, and developing advocacy and the pressure mechanisms for elected officials in order to ensure that at least between now and 23, some form of restructuring and devolution of powers and responsibilities takes place. And then hopefully, if we all again get engaged in the electoral process, more and more competent and listening and better people will come into governance so that they can now take up the challenge and keep on driving that process. Right. So I think that really is what is required. We cannot be put off by not being listened by these people, but I believe if we are able to form alliances, establish groups, develop a strategy, and have leaders who are effective to lead this process of engagement, of advocacy, of putting pressure, we may be able to begin to impact on change. And I think we need to recognize, and this is part of the problem in Nigeria generally, we are too impatient and want to see change tomorrow. And change doesn't happen like that. Change requires a very persistent, very resilient, very focused struggle and planning and the application of intellect and the energy to bring about positive changes. You know, so what we are always in a hurry. So if we want to change, we want to do everything at a go, rather than, that's why the key pillar of my presentation today is the need to recognize what I call incremental positive changes, and to keep on building and adding value on this. So between now and in the next 3 years, before the next electoral cycle, what can we achieve?
Absolutely.
So let's focus on what we can achieve in the next 3 years, you know, hoping that while we perceive and achieve that, we are also working to ensure that more qualitative, better people come into the process, you know, in the next electoral cycle, which means that then they will pick up, and also more advocacy with them can also bring additional changes. I think we young people, I will advise that we begin to recognize the need to get involved, to not be impatient, to be resilient, and to recognize sustainable change only occurs incrementally. You know, so if you want everything to happen tomorrow, you will be frustrated.
Absolutely.
And you will give up, unfortunately. You know,
and I think that's what we're trying to do here. I think it's so easy to look at the situation and feel helpless. But I think in speaking with people like you, Professor Jega, and speaking with other people who have come on the platform, it's really good for young people to see that there are people out there who have done their part to impart change, and that are also giving a bit of guidance as to what we can actually practically do to actually impact change. So it's really good to have you here. Before we go, we have Murtala Nyako in the audience, patiently waiting. So I wonder if you have any comments to make for us today. Thank you very much for joining us. You have the floor. Sorry, Murtala Nyako? Okay, so maybe we're having troubles there with the speakers. Unfortunately, it would have been good to hear from you. We also have Al-Hassan here in the audience, so we've opened the floor for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fatima. I want to actually congratulate Professor Jega for the excellent presentation. And I think such activities should continue. And we need to actually come together and salvage the situation. Since we have known the problems, what we need to do is actually to come together and take these points and find solutions to our problems of inaction, our problems of either refusing to change or to change rapidly for our personal aggrandizement. And I think the big question is attitude. We all know the right thing, and yet we don't do the right thing. So that kind of attitude must change. And we need to have concerted efforts from all angles. You know, the people who are politicians, the academia, the business people, all must have to come together to see that we have a point,
okay.
We have a platform, we have ideas that have been integrated together to see we have something positive for us in the north, in Nigeria. There are a lot of democracies, they have succeeded. They have succeeded because they have the right attitude to their policies. So the big question is how to change the attitude. We have talked about this several times. People are refusing to change. They all know the right thing, and yet they do the wrong.
Right. So I think that's a really good point about how do we change the attitude even from top to bottom. I know Professor Jega, you did mention that there is that need for a leadership.
Just for personal aggrandizement.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for taking the floor, Mala Al-Hassan. Thank you very much for being with us. So like you said, there is that need for a change in attitude, top to bottom. And I wonder what the best approach is to kind of impart that. Malam Murtala Nyako, unfortunately, we cannot get your comments in for the day, but we'll turn back to Professor Attahiru Jega for any comments that he has to make and or any closing remarks he has to make so we can start wrapping up this session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Once again, I would like to express my appreciation for being given this opportunity to share ideas. And I hope to incite or catalyze discussion, hoping that we may all be able to contribute to positive changes, because really Nigeria is sliding, you know, and unless we all join hands to stop and halt the slide, things may be worse than they are. And God forbid that to happen. So young men and women, you in particular, need to really come out. Politics is local. Move into your communities, organize, sensitize, engage, put pressure, do advocacy, and do practical work that can not only make you gain the confidence of your people, but also make them to begin to be more actively involved in bringing about positive changes in our communities and in our states. This is very, very important. I recall a popular saying by one philosopher leader about how an example, a personal example, is always better than a lecture, argument, or speech, you know, and that emphasizes the issue of personal example and the leadership. If you are given an elective position, you know, you are asked to be a leader, and you must be a leader in all senses of the word, you know, and so compliance with due process, obeying the laws, not abusing or misusing power itself sets example and wins confidence and trust. And unfortunately, when people look at our leaders, all they see are people who are so self-serving, you know, and who do not seem to care about human security and the welfare and the well-being of the people. And no wonder, therefore, many people increasingly withdraw from the sphere of governance and from participation, because they are now all preoccupied with survival, how to survive poverty, you know, and how to feed their families, or how to survive banditry and the wanton killing that takes place in our villages. So really, we have a lot of work to do. We must get involved. And when we get involved, we must create alliances, and we must develop agenda, and we must be very active, and we must refuse, and we must, in all our individual work, we must show personal example, and that can inspire and help this change of attitude. Right. You know, people have assumed an attitude because of what they see and what they hear, you know, and that can only change if they begin to see differently and to hear differently. You know? So really it's very, very important. We all have a role in this. Yeah. But the most important thing is politics is local. Get back to your communities, get involved, and don't be afraid, and don't be discouraged, be resilient. And I tell you, once hands are joined, mountains can be moved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jega, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us and be here today with us, to impart such great knowledge with, into us, and also to start the conversation. Really, I think it's a great point to hear the presentation and learn so much. And I think the key takeaways is that we all have a role, and that we do need to form partnerships and actually see what we can do to impart change. And we need to lead by example, even as individuals, be the change we want to see in this world. So thank you so much for your time. I know there's a lot of people with their hands up in the audience. We have, I'd say over 30 hands up. So it would be all night pretty much if we were to answer all the questions. Unfortunately, to our audience members, we won't be able to get all the questions across. If you do have pressing questions, don't forget to visit our website, www.trilogy.net/talks. You can leave your comments or questions there, and we'll try to get any pressing ones to Professor Jega on your behalf. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And thank you very, very much, Professor Jega, for coming here today to join us. And it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolute pleasure. I'd like to take this time just to say thank you, everyone, for joining us, taking time out of your evening. This is a great, project of passion. It's a great platform to really, unite people, educate people, and bring people together and give people hope. To know that there is possibility for change and there are steps that we can take. So thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to also thank my group members and teammates with whom we wouldn't be able to do anything without them. We have Nasruddin Yakubu, very hardworking. Thank you very much for all your effort. We have Shamsuddin Mama, also amazing teammate, and it's been great working with the two of them to try to bring this platform together and actually educate people. With that, I'd like to wish you all a good night from wherever you are. And don't forget to continue the conversation on our forum, www.trilogy.net/forum. Dr. Jega, thank you, Professor Jega, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. All the best.
All the best. Thank you.